Campaign 2020 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Quick Trip, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, and Wisconsin Operating Engineers Local 139.
Joseph Connelly of Oshkosh is an independent candidate in the 53rd Assembly District. Joseph, welcome to WisconsinEye.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me.
Well, when I interview third-party candidates, first question I traditionally ask is, why aren't you a D or an R?
Sure. In my case this time, I've never identified strongly with either party. I've always considered myself open to argument and open to rationale around issues. And to be perfectly frank, I believe that the partisan bickering and infighting right now is leading to an outsized amount of dysfunction in our government. And one of the reasons that I'm running is to kind of help our government get back on track, get back to being productive and representing everyone. So I just don't see a place for myself with a party at the moment.
Well, on your campaign website, you say that Wisconsin has been, your phrase, gerrymandered to the extreme. Does that mean you're a fan of the governor's idea of a People's Maps Commission drawing the next maps and then sending them to the to lawmakers to be enacted?
Sure. So my stance on how the maps get made is kind of not well formed. I don't necessarily think that the governor's commission is necessarily the path forward. And the reason I say that is because I'm a pragmatist. The Wisconsin State Constitution does dictate that the maps will be drawn by the majority party, well, not the majority party, but by the legislature. And, the majority party is not going to let that go willingly. And I don't think the courts are going to help this particular issue here in Wisconsin. So I do see the path forward for tackling this being something that has to be internal. It needs to be something that comes through the legislature. And I don't think that the governor's commission really stands a legitimate shot there. What I'm hoping is that enough people will focus on candidates like me or candidates that have a real strong inclination towards fair maps and voting them in, because we don't need many people to be very reasonable or very predetermined in this. We just need to make sure that we have a body of people inside the legislature that is going to tip the balance, right? Tip the majority balance. And if we can get enough people in there, it might only be 10 or 15, they have a real shot at making sure that we have some fair maps come out of this next session.
Okay. Let's talk about the pandemic, which we're all dealing with tragically. State Senate Republicans would like to come into session and overturn the governor's statewide mask edict. What's your position on the masks from a statewide standpoint?
Sure. So I mean, like I'm sure just about everyone is a little bit fed up with wearing masks all the time, but I do consider it a very small thing that we can do. There's so little that we have control over right now, and wearing a mask is something that has been shown through the science to help mitigate the spread of this disease. It's not unreasonable to ask people to wear shoes or shirts in a public restaurant during a time of a pandemic. I don't see being asked to wear a mask in public as an overstep. I don't see it as an infringement on our liberty. And looking at the numbers since the mask mandate has come out, the growth of COVID in Wisconsin has stabilized. It was on an upward trajectory. It's still not great, but it's not increasing day over day like it had been. So it seems to be, there seems to be an effect there. And I'm all for public health measures.
Okay. We got a report Monday that said tax collections held up in the year that ended June 30. They actually increased slightly. Everyone's worried about pandemic and tax collections in the current budget year. If we don't collect $1 billion or $1.5 billion, would you come down on the side of raising taxes or cutting spending?
I'm a pragmatist, so I'm going to say both potentially. What we don't want to do is take on an enormous amount of debt. We don't want to get ourselves into a situation where we're going to be paying out long-term servicing, lending for the state. So we do need to make sure that we get our fiscal house in order. And I think that every Wisconsinite understands how budgets work, inside their own home. Sometimes things cost more. Groceries cost more. It doesn't mean that we can just go out and print money or take on more debt. We have to look at ourselves. We have to think about where we're going to increase spending. We need to think about how we are going to address those shortfalls. So it's probably not something that anybody wants to hear, but I do think that, if we come up significantly short, we need to look at both sides of that coin, raising revenue and cutting, spending. It just has to be done.
Okay. Hospitals have been on the front line nationally and, of course, in Wisconsin on treating COVID-19 patients. If you're in the legislature voting on the next state budget, should hospitals get an even greater priority than they might have in the current budget?
Yeah, so I've been thinking about this issue a lot. And I would say that generally, unfortunately, perhaps, hospitals aren't a public service. They are privately run organizations. And paying for hospitals isn't the mandate of our government. So I would say that we've seen from a federal level that the support that we had imagined would be there for these people hasn't been. Stockpiles of PPE, access to ventilators and equipment. So if we are going to pour money and resources into public health, I would like to see Wisconsin do a better job of managing the supply chain, making sure that we have PPE, making sure that we have the chemical reagents that we need for expanding testing if we need to do that, so that can be ready and available for public health efforts. But I don't necessarily see a need for us to go rushing to pay for a brand new marble floor in a hospital either.
Okay. State Senator Chris Kappinga this week introduced a bill that said, if you're a business or an organization, and if you have complied with CDC guidelines on COVID to protect your customers or employers, you should be exempt from lawsuits over a COVID lawsuit. Do we need a state law like that, Joseph?
I am a small business owner myself. I understand the value in protecting businesses and their interests. And this is a really crummy situation. But I also am very disappointed in our state and national messaging around what proper guidelines should be. The CDC, unfortunately has been politicized as of late. I'm not sure that there's a whole lot of trust there. And leaders at every level have said, the reaction and the things that you do to mitigate COVID need to be done at a lower and lower level. So unfortunately, I think that has fallen to business owners, right? There are a lot of businesses out there that are maybe going above and beyond to protect people against COVID, maybe taking it a little bit more laxly. I would want stronger guidelines with better messaging. Maybe this is an OSHA deal instead of a CDC deal as we move forward. But if we can get that established, I support legislation like that, but I don't think that exists in a tangible enough manner right now for it to be useful. So I would encourage small business owners, large business owners to be pressuring their politicians to get their act together and, to come out with a unified set of guidelines that we can get behind. And then we could talk about protecting businesses from lawsuits. But right now, as it is, you have employees maybe being asked to work shoulder to shoulder in meatpacking facilities. A lot of that stuff is just irresponsible at the moment. And I don't know that that an employee in that situation should not have a matter to address that those conditions.
Okay. What's your position on legalizing both medical and recreational marijuana, please?
I don't have a strong position on that. That's one where I would want to go in and listen to the debate surrounding it, listen to the actual context and details. I'm not opposed to the legalization of marijuana in a medical or even recreational aspect, but I would really want to make an evidence-based decision. I would like to learn about what we've seen from states that are that have already adopted it. Does it affect revenue? Does it affect the safe use of this substance? And if we can come to an agreement through healthy debate around the issue, I could imagine supporting legislation like that.
Okay. This week, the governor had wanted the legislature in session to vote on his 9 bills dealing with policing reform, ban chokeholds, ban no-knock warrants, uniform standards, training standards for those that want to be police officers, etc. Have you reviewed those bills? Do you have a position on the governor's bills and whether they should become law? Sure.
So I do think that there is room for a lot of reform inside policing right now. I'm leery of going hyper specific on how we address these things. Banning chokeholds, for instance. The reason they teach those skills is because there is a time and a place for that. I'm a former military member. We learned combatives, and there are going to be reasonable situations where there's a genuine threat to a police officer or the public where maneuvers like that, have a legitimate time and place. So I don't want to be hyper partisan about thinking about these decisions. I want to be very mindful, but there is obviously a huge need for reform. We need police departments, law enforcement officers to hold each other to account to a greater extent than unfortunately we've seen. I do think that a lot of that is training based. If we were going to spend money supporting our law enforcement, I would love to see an increased focus on training. So I am very supportive of reform measures, but I also don't want to kneecap. I don't want to put our police officers in any greater harm's way than they already are because they've been legislated out of being able to use tactics that do have a time and place under certain circumstances.
2 questions on property taxes because we're a high property tax state. To control property taxes, local governments, schools and local governments have faced caps and limits on property tax levies for more than 20 years. If you're in the legislature voting on the next state budget, would you vote to continue those caps and limits on property tax levies?
So that's an interesting question because that should be a more local level affair in a lot of cases. Counties and local municipalities establishing their own property tax rates or at least being able to alter them. I don't want to see that stuff run away, but I also am very familiar with the fact that some of these caps came into place when some school districts around our state, and this ties very strongly into school funding because a lot of the revenue comes from property taxes. A lot of school districts were being fiscally responsible and not overspending. And so they got actually kind of capped at a lower level than some other districts that were being a little looser with the purse strings at the time. So that does present real issues. And I would like to see the ability for local governments to levy revenue inside their districts because quality schools support property values inside these places. So it's in my best interest as a homeowner in Oshkosh to have quality schools in Oshkosh. And every time Oshkosh goes back to referendum with their hand out asking for more money so that they can put a new roof on a school or, decommission a school that's 75 years old, those decisions impact the future value of my home. And so I would like our local elected leaders to have more say in how they collect those revenues.
So you'd like local elected leaders to have more options to raise revenues? Is that a fair statement?
Yes, I don't think that a statewide mandate on how we collect tax revenues for local issues like this is appropriate. If Oshkosh decides to raise property taxes and the people don't like it, we vote out that body that just made that decision. But right now, there's too much tension across the state. Something that works for Milwaukee isn't going to necessarily work in Oshkosh, in Rhinelander, in Waupun. So I want those people to have the ability to raise revenues the way they should.
Last year, the governor recommended raising the gas tax. It's now 30.9 cents per gallon. Hasn't been increased in 10 or 12 years. The goal is to stabilize funding for highways and bridges. Could you vote to raise the gas tax?
I don't know necessarily that I would vote to raise the gas tax, because that disproportionately affects certain types of people. Owners of vehicles that are low mileage vehicles will pay a steeper premium for keeping their vehicles on the road. Somebody who has the means to go out and buy a Tesla won't feel that at all. So I would be open to exploring ways of stabilizing our transportation fund, but I would like to look at doing something that's a little bit more in line with actual use. So maybe that is a mileage tax come registration time. Perhaps that is looking at gross vehicle weight and asking industry, commercial enterprises that put tons and tons and tons of use on our highways to pitch in a bit more. So I see the need. I want to hear the debate, but I don't know that I'm particularly comfortable penalizing people who commute more than others, or people that don't have the means to find themselves in a more fuel efficient vehicle.
New subject. When a school district or a local government wants to do a major public works project, should they have to give a preference to Wisconsin businesses? The reason I ask is in 2015, out-of-state contractors got public works contracts worth $72 million. That more than doubled to $146 million in 2018. Local governments have to give a preference to Wisconsin businesses?
I think that makes sense, right? It's taxpayers' dollars that are going to pay for that thing, and it would be great to keep those dollars inside our communities to the greatest extent possible. So preference, that's a loaded word. We're going to have to figure out what that exactly means, because I do want a district like that sits on the border, like in Hudson, and maybe there's a contractor just across the river that can do it for 2/3 the cost as a Wisconsin company on our side of the river. I want them to be able to have that option. But all things being equal, I think we should spend Wisconsin dollars in Wisconsin.
Then final question, you're an independent. You want to highlight any differences between the R and the D that you're up against on November 3rd?
Sure. So the primary reason I'm running this time around is because I am deeply concerned about the state of our democracy. Over the last 10 years, especially 15 years in Wisconsin, things have become a little bit less democratic than they should be. We've had in the lame duck session after the 2018 election, my opponent was one of almost everyone in his party that voted to transfer powers of the governorship into the state legislature. And I don't see that as healthy. That is not separation of powers. That is not balancing things. When people went to the polls in November of that year, we knew what we were voting for. And whether you're on the Democrat or the Republican side of things, what we need to have in our state moving forward is an effective government where we know the rules and the people have a voice. Gerrymandering is a huge issue to me right now because we've gotten to a point where in the last 2 years, every general election in Wisconsin, the statewide general elections have gone Democrat or progressive. But our state legislature is still overwhelmingly Republican, and that's a result of the maps that we have drawn. Gerrymandering is a bigger issue today than it ever has been because we have access to big data. We have access to computers where I am a data scientist. I have a master's in data science. And with that data set, I could sit down at my laptop right here and overnight redraw the maps in a way that would completely change the makeup of our state legislature. And that is criminal. That goes against self-governance. Right now, if you're a Democrat in my district, your vote doesn't matter because there are not enough of those votes to win an election in my district, which means that my representative doesn't have to be responsive to a large number of his constituents because the next election doesn't matter to them. So I see that as the fundamental flaw in what's happening right now. And if given the opportunity to represent my community and my state, I will work fervently to make sure that our democracy is functioning for the next generation. We can't have minority control. That's not what this country is based on, and I'm going to fight it tooth and nail.
Thank you. Joseph Connelly of Oshkosh is an independent candidate in the 53rd Assembly District. The election is November 3. Joseph, thank you for talking to WisconsinEye.
Thank you very much for having me.
Campaign 2020 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Quick Trip, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, and Wisconsin Operating Engineers Local 139.